The Age of Innocence by Edith Wharton, Book 2, Chapter 24. They lunched slowly and meditatively, with mute intervals between rushes of talk. For the spell once broken they had much to say, and yet moments when saying became the mere accompaniment to long duologues of silence. Archer kept the talk from his own affairs, not with conscious intention, but because he did not want to miss a word of her history. And leaning on the table, her chin resting on her clasped hands, she talked to him of the year and a half since they had met. She had grown tired of what people call society. New York was kind, it was almost oppressively hospitable. She should never forget the way in which it had welcomed her back, but after the first flush of novelty she had found herself, as she phrased it, too different to care for the things it cared about, and so she had decided to try Washington, where one was supposed to meet more varieties of people and of opinion. And on the whole she should probably settle down in Washington and make a home there for poor Medora, who had worn out the patience of all her other relations just at the time when she most needed looking after and protecting from matrimonial perils. "But Dr. Carver, aren't you afraid of Dr. Carver? I hear he's been staying with you at the Blenkers." She smiled. "Oh, the Carver danger is over. Dr. Carver is a very clever man. He wants a rich wife to finance his plans, and Medora is simply a good advertisement as a convert." "A convert to what?" "To all sorts of new and crazy social schemes. But do you know, they interest me more than the blind conformity to tradition, somebody else's tradition, that I see among our own friends. It seems stupid to have discovered America only to make it into a copy of another country." She smiled across the table. "Do you suppose Christopher Columbus would have taken all that trouble just to go to the opera with the Selfridge Marries?" Archer changed colour. "And Beaufort, do you say these things to Beaufort?" he asked abruptly. "I haven't seen him for a long time, but I used to, and he understands." "Ah, it's what I've always told you. You don't like us. And you like Beaufort because he's so unlike us." He looked about the bare room and out at the bare beach and the row of stark white village houses strung along the shore. "We're damnably dull. We've no character, no colour, no variety. I wonder," he broke out, "why you don't go back?" Her eyes darkened, and he expected an indignant rejoinder, but she sat silent as if thinking over what he had said, and he grew frightened lest she should answer that she wondered too. At length she said, "I believe it's because of you." It was impossible to make the confession more dispassionately, or in a tone less encouraging to the vanity of the person addressed. Archer reddened to the temples, but dared not move or speak. It was as if her words had been some rare butterfly that the least motion might drive off on startled wings, but that might gather a flock about it if it were left undisturbed. "At least," she continued, "it was you who made me understand that under the dullness there are things so fine and sensitive and delicate that even those I most cared for in my other life look cheap in comparison. I don't know how to explain myself." She drew together her troubled brows. "But it seems as if I'd never before understood with how much that is hard and shabby and base the most exquisite pleasures may be paid." "Exquisite pleasures? It's something to have had them," he felt like retorting, but the appeal in her eyes kept him silent. "I want," she went on, "to be perfectly honest with you, and with myself. For a long time I've hoped this chance would come, that I might tell you how you've helped me, what you've made of me." Archer sat staring beneath frowning brows. He interrupted her with a laugh. "And what do you make out that you've made of me?" She paled a little. "Of you?" "Yes, for I'm of your making much more than you ever were of mine. I'm the man who married one woman because another one told him to." Her paleness turned to a fugitive flush. "I thought you promised you were not to say such things today." "Ah, how like a woman! None of you will ever see a bad business through." She lowered her voice. "Is it a bad business? For May?" He stood in the window, drumming against the raised sash, and feeling in every fibre the wistful tenderness with which she had spoken her cousin's name. For that's the thing we've always got to think of, haven't we? By your own showing," she insisted. "My own showing?" he echoed, his blank eyes still on the sea. "Or if not," she continued, pursuing her own thought with a painful application, "if it's not worth while to have given up, to have missed things, so that others may be saved from disillusionment and misery, then everything I came home for, everything that made my other life seem by contrast so bare and so poor because no one there took account of them, all these things are a sham or a dream." He turned around without moving from his place. "And in that case there's no reason on earth why you shouldn't go back," he concluded for her. Her eyes were clinging to him desperately. "Oh, is there no reason?" "Not if you staked your all on the success of my marriage. My marriage," he said savagely, "isn't going to be a sight to keep you here." She made no answer, and he went on. "What's the use? You gave me my first glimpse of a real life, and at the same moment you asked me to go on with the sham one. It's beyond human enduring. That's all." "Oh, don't say that, when I'm enduring it," she burst out, her eyes filling. Her arms had dropped along the table, and she sat with her face abandoned to his gaze as if in the recklessness of a desperate peril. The face exposed her as much as if it had been her whole person, with the soul behind it. Archer stood dumb, overwhelmed by what it suddenly told him. "You too? Oh, all this time, you too?" For answer she let the tears on her lids overflow and run slowly downward. Half the width of the room was still between them, and neither made any show of moving. Archer was conscious of a curious indifference to her bodily presence. He would hardly have been aware of it if one of her hands she had flung out on the table had not drawn his gaze, as on the occasion when, in the little 23rd Street house, he had kept his eyes on it in order not to look at her face. Now his imagination spun about the hand as about the edge of a vortex, but still he made no effort to draw nearer. He had known the love that is fed on caresses and feeds them, but this passion that was closer than his bones was not to be superficially satisfied. His one terror was to do anything which might efface the sound and impression of her words, his one thought that he should never again feel quite alone. But after a moment the sense of waste and ruin overcame him. There they were, close together and safe and shut in, yet so chained to their separate destinies that they might as well have been half the world apart. "What's the use? When will you go back?" he broke out, a great, hopeless, "How on earth can I keep you?" crying out to her beneath his words. She sat motionless with lowered lids. "Oh, I shan't go yet." "Not yet? Some time, then? Some time that you already foresee?" At that she raised her clearest eyes. "I promise you, not as long as you hold out, not as long as we can look straight at each other like this." He dropped into his chair. What her answer really said was, "If you lift a finger, you'll drive me back, back to all the abominations you know of and all the temptations you half guess." He understood it as clearly as if she had uttered the words, and the thought kept him anchored to his side of the table in a kind of moved and sacred submission. "What a life for you!" he groaned. "Oh, as long as it's a part of yours." "And mine a part of yours?" She nodded. "And that's to be all, for either of us?" "Well, it is all, isn't it?" At that he sprang up, forgetting everything but the sweetness of her face. She rose too, not as if to meet him or to flee from him, but quietly, as though the worst of the task were done and she had only to wait, so quietly that, as he came close, her outstretched hands acted not as a check but as a guide to him. They fell into his, while her arms, extended but not rigid, kept him far enough off to let her surrendered face say the rest. They may have stood in that way for a long time, or only for a few moments, but it was long enough for her silence to communicate all she had to say, and for him to feel that only one thing mattered. He must do nothing to make this meeting their last. He must leave their future in her care, asking only that she should keep fast hold of it. Don't be unhappy," she said, with a break in her voice as she drew her hands away, and he answered, "You won't go back? You won't go back?" as if it were the one possibility he could not bear. "I won't go back," she said, and turning away she opened the door and led the way into the public dining-room. The strident school-teachers were gathering up their possessions preparatory to a straggling flight to the wharf. Across the beach lay the white steamboat at the pier, and over the sunlit waters Boston loomed in a line of haze. End of Chapter 24. Chapter 25. Once more on the boat and in the presence of others, Archer felt a tranquillity of spirit that surprised as much as it sustained him. The day, according to any current valuation, had been a rather ridiculous failure. He had not so much as touched Madame Olenska's hand with his lips, or extracted one word from her that gave promise of farther opportunities. Nevertheless, for a man sick with unsatisfied love, and parting for an indefinite period from the object of his passion, he felt himself almost humiliatingly calm and comforted. It was the perfect balance she had held between their loyalty to others and their honesty to themselves that had stirred and yet tranquillized him, a balance not artfully calculated, as her tears and her falterings showed, but resulting naturally from her unabashed sincerity. It filled him with a tender awe, now the danger was over, and made him thank the fates that no personal vanity, no sense of playing a part before sophisticated witnesses, had tempted him to tempt her. Even after they had clasped hands for good-bye at the Fall River station, and he had turned away alone, the conviction remained with him of having saved out of their meeting much more than he had sacrificed. He wandered back to the club, and went and sat alone in the deserted library, turning over in his thoughts every separate second of their hours together. It was clear to him, and it grew more clear under closer scrutiny, that if she should finally decide on returning to Europe, returning to her husband, it would not be because her old life tempted her, even on the new terms offered. No, she would go only if she felt herself becoming a temptation to Archer, a temptation to fall away from the standard they had both set up. Her choice would be to stay near him as long as he did not ask her to come nearer, and it depended on himself to keep her just there, safe but secluded. In the train these thoughts were still with him. They enclosed him in a kind of golden haze, through which the faces about him looked remote and indistinct. He had a feeling that if he spoke to his fellow-travellers they would not understand what he was saying. In this state of abstraction he found himself the following morning waking to the reality of a stifling September day in New York. The heat-withered faces in the long train streamed past him, and he continued to stare at them through the same golden blur. But suddenly, as he left the station, one of the faces detached itself, came closer, and forced itself upon his consciousness. It was, as he instantly recalled, the face of the young man he had seen the day before passing out of the Parker house, and had noted as not conforming to type, as not having an American hotel face. The same thing struck him now, and again he became aware of a dim stir of former associations. The young man stood looking about him with the dazed air of the foreigner flung upon the harsh mercies of American travel. Then he advanced toward Archer, lifted his hat, and said in English, "Surely, monsieur, we met in London." "Ah, to be sure, in London!" Archer grasped his hand with curiosity and sympathy. "So you did get here after all?" he exclaimed, casting a wondering eye on the astute and haggard little countenance of young Carfry's French tutor. I got here, yes." Monsieur Riviere smiled with drawn lips. "But not for long. I return the day after tomorrow." He stood grasping his light valise in one neatly gloved hand, and gazing anxiously, perplexedly, almost appealingly into Archer's face. "I wonder, monsieur, since I've had the good luck to run across you, if I might—" "I was just going to suggest it. Come to luncheon, won't you? Downtown, I mean. If you'll look me up in my office, I'll take you to a very decent restaurant in that quarter." Monsieur Riviere was visibly touched and surprised. "You're too kind. But I was only going to ask if you would tell me how to reach some sort of conveyance. There are no porters, and no one here seems to listen." "I know. Our American stations must surprise you. When you ask for a porter, they give you chewing gum. But if you'll come along, I'll extricate you, and you really must lunch with me, you know." The young man, after a just perceptible hesitation, replied with profuse thanks, and in a tone that did not carry complete conviction, that he was already engaged. But when they had reached the comparative reassurance of the street, he asked if he might call that afternoon. Archer, at ease in the midsummer leisure of the office, fixed an hour and scribbled his address, which the Frenchman pocketed with reiterated thanks and a wide flourish of his hat. A horse-car received him, and Archer walked away. Punctually at the hour Monsieur Riviere appeared, shaved, smoothed out, but still unmistakably drawn and serious. Archer was alone in his office, and the young man, before accepting the seat he proffered, began abruptly, "I believe I saw you, sir, yesterday in Boston." The statement was insignificant enough, and Archer was about to frame an assent when his words were checked by something mysterious yet illuminating in his visitor's insistent gaze. "It is extraordinary, very extraordinary," Monsieur Riviere continued, "that we should have met in the circumstances in which I find myself." "What circumstances?" Archer asked, wondering a little crudely if he needed money. Monsieur Riviere continued to study him with tentative eyes. "I have come not to look for employment, as I spoke of doing when we last met, but on a special mission." "Ah!" Archer exclaimed. In a flash the two meetings had connected themselves in his mind. He paused to take in the situation thus suddenly lighted up for him, and Monsieur Riviere also remained silent, as if aware that what he had said was enough. "A special mission," Archer at length repeated. The young Frenchman, opening his palms, raised them slightly, and the two men continued to look at each other across the office desk till Archer roused himself to say, "Do sit down," whereupon Monsieur Riviere bowed, took a distant chair, and again waited. "It was about this mission that you wanted to consult me?" Archer finally asked. Monsieur Riviere bent his head. "Not in my own behalf. On that score I have fully dealt with myself. I should like, if I may, to speak to you about the Countess Olenska." Archer had known for the last few minutes that the words were coming, but when they came they sent the blood rushing to his temples as if he had been caught by a bent-back branch in a thicket. "And on whose behalf," he asked, "do you wish to do this?" Monsieur Riviere met the question sturdily. "Well, I might say hers, if it did not sound like a liberty. Shall I say instead, on behalf of abstract justice?" Archer considered him ironically. "In other words, you are Count Olenski's messenger." He saw his blush more darkly reflected in Monsieur Riviere's sallow countenance. "Not to you, monsieur. If I come to you, it is on quite other grounds." "What right have you in the circumstances to be on any other ground?" Archer retorted. "If you're an emissary, you're an emissary." The young man considered. "My mission is over. As far as the Countess Olenska goes, it has failed." "I can't help that," Archer rejoined on the same note of irony. "No, but you can help." Monsieur Riviere paused, turned his hat about in his still carefully gloved hands, looked into its lining, and then back at Archer's face. "You can help, monsieur, I am convinced, to make it equally a failure with her family." Archer pushed back his chair and stood up. "Well, and by God I will!" he exclaimed. He stood with his hands in his pockets, staring down wrathfully at the little Frenchman, whose face, though he too had risen, was still an inch or two below the line of Archer's eyes. Monsieur Riviere paled to his normal hue. Paler than that his complexion could hardly turn. "Why the devil," Archer explosively continued, "should you have thought, since I suppose you are appealing to me on the ground of my relationship to Madame Olenska, that I should take a view contrary to the rest of her family?" The change of expression in Monsieur Riviere's face was for a time his only answer. His look passed from timidity to absolute distress. For a young man of his unusually resourceful mien, it would have been difficult to appear more disarmed and defenceless. "Oh, monsieur." "I can't imagine," Archer continued, "why you should have come to me when there are others so much nearer to the Countess. Still less why you thought I should be more accessible to the arguments I suppose you were sent over with." Monsieur Riviere took this onslaught with a disconcerting humility. "The arguments I want to present to you, monsieur, are my own, and not those I was sent over with." "Then I see still less reason for listening to them." Monsieur Riviere again looked into his hat, as if considering whether these last words were not sufficiently broad hint to put it on and be gone. Then he spoke with sudden decision. "Monsieur, will you tell me one thing? Is it my right to be here that you question, or do you perhaps believe the whole matter to be already closed?" His quiet insistence made Archer feel the clumsiness of his own bluster. Monsieur Riviere had succeeded in imposing himself. Archer, reddening slightly, dropped into his chair again and signed to the young man to be seated. "I beg your pardon, but why isn't the matter closed?" Monsieur Riviere gazed back at him with anguish. "You do, then, agree with the rest of the family that, in the face of the new proposals I have brought, it is hardly possible for Madame Olenska not to return to her husband?" "Good God!" Archer exclaimed, and his visitor gave out a low murmur of confirmation. "Before seeing her I saw, at Count Olenski's request, Mr. Lovell Mingott, with whom I had several talks before going to Boston. I understand that he represents his mother's view, and that Mrs. Manson Mingott's influence is great throughout her family." Archer sat silent, with the sense of clinging to the edge of a sliding precipice. The discovery that he had been excluded from a share in these negotiations, and even from the knowledge that they were on foot, caused him a surprise hardly dulled by the acuter wonder of what he was learning. He saw in a flash that if the family had ceased to consult him, it was because some deep tribal instinct warned them that he was no longer on their side, and he recalled, with a start of comprehension, a remark of May's during their drive home from Mrs. Manson Mingott's on the day of the archery meeting. Perhaps, after all, Ellen would be happier with her husband. Even in the tumult of new discoveries, Archer remembered his indignant exclamation, and the fact that since then his wife had never named Madame Olenska to him. Her careless allusion had no doubt been the straw held up to see which way the wind blew. The result had been reported to her family, and thereafter Archer had been tacitly omitted from their councils. He admired the tribal discipline which made May bow to this decision. She would not have done so, he knew, had her conscience protested, but she probably shared the family view that Madame Olenska would be better off as an unhappy wife than as a separated one, and that there was no use in discussing the case with Newland, who had an awkward way of suddenly not seeming to take the most fundamental things for granted. Archer looked up and met his visitor's anxious gaze. "Don't you know, monsieur? Is it possible you don't know? That the family begin to doubt if they have the right to advise the Countess to refuse her husband's last proposals." "The proposals you brought?" "The proposals I brought." It was on Archer's lips to exclaim that whatever he knew or did not know was no concern of Monsieur Riviere's, but something in the humble and yet courageous tenacity of Monsieur Riviere's gaze made him reject this conclusion, and he met the young man's question with another. "What is your object in speaking to me of this?" He had not to wait a moment for the answer. "To beg you, monsieur, to beg you with all the force I'm capable of, not to let her go back. Oh, don't let her!" Monsieur Riviere exclaimed. Archer looked at him with increasing astonishment. There was no mistaking the sincerity of his distress or the strength of his determination. He had evidently resolved to let everything go by the board but the supreme need of thus putting himself on record. Archer considered. "May I ask," he said at length, "if this is the line you took with the Countess Olenska?" Monsieur Riviere reddened, but his eyes did not falter. "No, monsieur. I accepted my mission in good faith. I really believed, for reasons I need not trouble you with, that it would be better for Madame Olenska to recover her situation, her fortune, the social consideration that her husband's standing gives her." "So I supposed. You could hardly have accepted such a mission otherwise." "I should not have accepted it." "Well, then?" Archer paused again, and their eyes met in another protracted scrutiny. "Ah, monsieur, after I had seen her, after I had listened to her, I knew she was better off here." "You knew?" "Monsieur, I discharged my mission faithfully. I put the Count's arguments, I stated his offers, without adding any comment of my own. The Countess was good enough to listen patiently. She carried her goodness so far as to see me twice. She considered impartially all I had come to say. And it was in the course of these 2 talks that I changed my mind, that I came to see things differently." "May I ask what led to this change?" "Simply seeing the change in her," Monsieur Riviere replied. "The change in her? Then you knew her before?" The young man's colour again rose. "I used to see her in her husband's house. I have known Count Olenski for many years. You can imagine that he would not have sent a stranger on such a mission." Archer's gaze, wandering away to the blank walls of the office, rested on a hanging calendar surmounted by the rugged features of the President of the United States. That such a conversation should be going on anywhere within the millions of square miles subject to his rule seemed as strange as anything that the imagination could invent. "The change? What sort of a change?"
Ah, monsieur, if I could tell you—" Monsieur Riviere paused. "Tenez, the discovery, I suppose, of what I'd never thought of before, that she's an American. And that if you're an American of her kind, of your kind, things that are accepted in certain other societies, or at least put up with as part of a general convenient give and take, become unthinkable, simply unthinkable. If Madame Olenska's relations understood what these things were, their opposition to her returning would no doubt be as unconditional as her own, but they seem to regard her husband's wish to have her back as proof of an irresistible longing for domestic life." Monsieur Riviere paused, and then added, "Whereas it's far from being as simple as that."
Archer looked back to the President of the United States, and then down at his desk and at the papers scattered on it. For a second or two he could not trust himself to speak. During this interval he heard Monsieur Riviere's chair pushed back, and was aware that the young man had risen. When he glanced up he saw that his visitor was as moved as himself. "Thank you," Archer said simply.
"There's nothing to thank me for, monsieur. It is I, rather—"
Monsieur Riviere broke off as if speech for him were too difficult.
"I should like, though," he continued in a firmer voice, "to add one thing. You asked me if I was in Count Olenski's employ. I am at this moment. I returned to him a few months ago for reasons of private necessity, such as may happen to anyone who has persons, ill and older persons, dependent on him. But from the moment I have taken the step of coming here to say these things to you, I consider myself discharged, and I shall tell him so on my return, and give him the reasons. That's all, monsieur."
Monsieur Riviere bowed and drew back a step. "Thank you," Archer said again, as their hands met. End of chapter 25. Chapter 26. Every year on the 15th of October, Fifth Avenue opened its shutters, unrolled its carpets, and hung up its triple layer of window curtains. By the 1st of November this household ritual was over, and society had begun to look about and take stock of itself. By the 15th the season was in full blast. Opera and theatres were putting forth their new attractions, dinner engagements were accumulating, and dates for dances being fixed. And punctually at about this time Mrs. Archer always said that New York was very much changed. Observing it from the lofty standpoint of a non-participant, she was able, with the help of Mr. Sillerton Jackson and Miss Sophie, to trace each new crack in its surface, and all the strange weeds pushing up between the ordered rows of social vegetables. It had been one of the amusements of Archer's youth to wait for this annual pronouncement of his mother's, and to hear her enumerate the minute signs of disintegration that his careless gaze had overlooked. For New York, to Mrs. Archer's mind, never changed without changing for the worse, and in this view Miss Sophie Jackson heartily concurred. Mr. Sillerton Jackson, as became a man of the world, suspended his judgment and listened with an amused impartiality to the lamentations of the ladies, but even he never denied that New York had changed, and Newland Archer, in the winter of the second year of his marriage, was himself obliged to admit that if it had not actually changed, it certainly was changing. These points had been raised as usual at Mrs. Archer's Thanksgiving dinner. At the date when she was officially enjoined to give thanks for the blessings of the year, it was her habit to take a mournful though not embittered stock of her world, and wonder what there was to be thankful for. At any rate, not the state of society. Society, if it could be said to exist, was rather a spectacle on which to call down biblical imprecations, and in fact every one knew what the Reverend Dr. Ashmore meant when he chose a text from Jeremiah, chapter 2, verse 25, for his Thanksgiving sermon. Dr. Ashmore, the new rector of St. Matthew's, had been chosen because he was very advanced. His sermons were considered bold in thought and novel in language. When he fulminated against fashionable society, he always spoke of its trend, and to Mrs. Archer it was terrifying and yet fascinating to feel herself part of a community that was trending. "There is no doubt that Dr. Ashmore is right. There is a marked trend," she said, as if it were something visible and measurable, like a crack in a house. "It was odd, though, to preach about it on Thanksgiving," Miss Jackson opened, and her hostess dryly rejoined, "Oh, he means us to give thanks for what's left." Archer had been wont to smile at these annual vaticinations of his mother's, but this year even he was obliged to acknowledge as he listened to an enumeration of the changes that the trend was visible. "The extravagance in dress," Miss Jackson began.
Sillerton took me to the first night of the opera, and I can only tell you that Jane Merry's dress was the only one I recognized from last year, and even that had had the front panel changed. Yet I know she got it out from Worth only 2 years ago, because my seamstress always goes in to make over her Paris dresses before she wears them." "Ah, Jane Merry is one of us," said Mrs. Archer, sighing, as if it were not such an enviable thing to be in an age when ladies were beginning to flaunt abroad their Paris dresses as soon as they were out of the custom-house, instead of letting them mellow under lock and key in the manner of Mrs. Archer's contemporaries. "Yes, she's one of the few. In my youth," Miss Jackson rejoined, "it was considered vulgar to dress in the newest fashions, and Amy Sillerton has always told me that in Boston the rule was to put away one's Paris dresses for 2 years. Old Mrs. Baxter Pennilow, who did everything handsomely, used to import 12 a year, 2 velvet, 2 satin, 2 silk, and the other 6 of poplin and the finest cashmere. It was a standing order, and as she was ill for 2 years before she died, they found 48 Worth dresses that had never been taken out of tissue paper, and when the girls left off their mourning, they were able to wear the first lot at the symphony concerts without looking in advance of the fashion. Ah, well, Boston is more conservative than New York, but I always think it's a safe rule for a lady to lay aside her French dresses for 1 season," Mrs. Archer conceded. "It was Beaufort who started the new fashion by making his wife clap her new clothes on her back as soon as they arrived. I must say at times it takes all Regina's distinction not to look like— Miss Jackson glanced around the table, caught Janey's bulging gaze, and took refuge in an unintelligible murmur. "Like her rivals," said Mr. Sillerton Jackson, with the air of producing an epigram. "Oh!" the ladies murmured, and Mrs. Archer added, partly to distract her daughter's attention from forbidden topics, "Poor Regina! Her Thanksgiving hasn't been a very cheerful one, I'm afraid. Have you heard the rumours about Beaufort's speculations, Sillerton?" Mr. Jackson nodded carelessly. Every one had heard the rumours in question, and he scorned to confirm a tale that was already common property. A gloomy silence fell upon the party. No one really liked Beaufort, and it was not wholly unpleasant to think the worst of his private life, but the idea of his having brought financial dishonour on his wife's family was too shocking to be enjoyed even by his enemies. Archer's New York tolerated hypocrisy in private relations, but in business matters it exacted a limpid and impeccable honesty. It was a long time since any well-known banker had failed discreditably, but every one remembered the social extinction visited on the heads of the firm when the last event of this kind had happened. It would be the same with the Beauforts, in spite of his power and her popularity. Not all the leagued strength of the Dallas connection would save poor Regina if there were any truth in the reports of her husband's unlawful speculations. The talk took refuge in less ominous topics, but everything they touched on seemed to confirm Mrs. Archer's sense of an accelerated trend. "Of course, Newland, I know you let dear May go to Mrs. Struthers Sunday evenings," she began, and May interposed gaily, "Oh, you know, everybody goes to Mrs. Struthers now, and she was invited to Granny's last reception." It was thus, Archer reflected, that New York managed its transitions, conspiring to ignore them till they were well over, and then in all good faith imagining that they had taken place in a preceding age. There was always a traitor in the citadel, and after he, or generally she, had surrendered the keys, what was the use of pretending that it was impregnable? Once people had tasted of Mrs. Struthers' easy Sunday hospitality, they were not likely to sit at home remembering that her champagne was transmuted shoe-polish. "I know, dear, I know," Mrs. Archer sighed. "Such things have to be, I suppose, as long as amusement is what people go out for. But I've never quite forgiven your cousin Madame Olenska for being the first person to countenance Mrs. Struthers." A sudden blush rose to young Mrs. Archer's face. It surprised her husband as much as the other guests about the table. "Oh, Ellen," she murmured, much in the same accusing and yet deprecating tone in which her parents might have said, "Oh, the Blenkers." It was the note which the family had taken to sounding on the mention of the Countess Olenska's name, since she had surprised and inconvenienced them by remaining obdurate to her husband's advances, but on May's lips it gave food for thought, and Archer looked at her with the sense of strangeness that sometimes came over him when she was most in the tone of her environment. His mother, with less of her usual sensitiveness to atmosphere, still insisted, I've always thought that people like the Countess Olenska, who have lived in aristocratic societies, ought to help us to keep up our social distinctions instead of ignoring them." May's blush remained permanently vivid. It seemed to have a significance beyond that implied by the recognition of Madame Olenska's social bad faith. "I've no doubt we all seem alike to foreigners," said Miss Jackson tartly.
"I don't think Ellen cares for society, but nobody knows exactly what she does care for," May continued, as if she'd been groping for something non-committal.
"Ah, well," Mrs. Archer sighed again. Everybody knew that the Countess Olenska was no longer in the good graces of her family. Even her devoted champion, old Mrs. Manson Mingott, had been unable to defend her refusal to return to her husband. The Mingotts had not proclaimed their disapproval aloud, their sense of solidarity was too strong. They had simply, as Mrs. Welland said, "let poor Ellen find her own level." And that, mortifyingly and incomprehensibly, was in the dim depths where the Blenkers prevailed, and people who wrote celebrated their untidy rights. It was incredible, but it was a fact, that Ellen, in spite of all her opportunities and her privileges, had become simply bohemian. The fact enforced the contention that she had made a fatal mistake in not returning to Count Olenski. After all, a young woman's place was under her husband's roof, especially when she had left it in circumstances that, well, if one had cared to look into them.
"Madame Olenska is a great favourite with the gentlemen," said Miss Sophy, with her air of wishing to put forth something conciliatory when she knew that she was planting a dart.
"Ah, that's the danger that a young woman like Madame Olenska is always exposed to," Mrs. Archer mournfully agreed, and the ladies, on this conclusion, gathered up their trains to seek the carcel globes of the drawing-room, while Archer and Mr. Sillerton Jackson withdrew to the Gothic library. Once established before the grate, and consoling himself for the inadequacy of the dinner by the perfection of his cigar, Mr. Jackson became portentous and communicable.
"If the Beaufort smash comes," he announced, "there are going to be disclosures."
Archer raised his head quickly. He could never hear the name without the sharp vision of Beaufort's heavy figure, opulently furred and shod, advancing through the snow at Skuytercliff.
"There's bound to be," Mr. Jackson continued, "the nastiest kind of a cleaning up. He hasn't spent all his money on Regina."
"Oh, well, that's discounted, isn't it? My belief is he'll pull out yet," said the young man, wanting to change the subject.
Perhaps. I know he was to see some of the influential people today. Of course," Mr. Jackson reluctantly conceded, "it's to be hoped they can tide him over, this time anyhow. I shouldn't like to think of poor Regina's spending the rest of her life in some shabby foreign watering place for bankrupts."
Archer said nothing. It seemed to him so natural, however tragic, that money ill-gotten should be cruelly expiated, that his mind, hardly lingering over Mrs. Beaufort's doom, wandered back to closer questions. What was the meaning of May's blush when the Countess Olenska had been mentioned? 4 months had passed since the midsummer day that he and Madame Olenska had spent together, and since then he had not seen her. He knew that she had returned to Washington, to the little house which she and Medora Manson had taken there. He had written to her once, a few words asking when they were to meet again, and she had even more briefly replied, "Not yet." Since then there had been no farther communication between them, and he had built up within himself a kind of sanctuary in which he throned among his secret thoughts and longings. Little by little it became the scene of his real life, of his only rational activities. Thither he brought the books he read, the ideas and feelings which nourished him, his judgments and his visions. Outside it, in the scene of his actual life, he moved with a growing sense of unreality and insufficiency, blundering against familiar prejudices and traditional points of view as an absent-minded man goes on bumping into the furniture of his own room. Absent, that was what he was, so absent from everything most densely real and near to those about him that it sometimes startled him to find they still imagined he was there. He became aware that Mr. Jackson was clearing his throat, preparatory to farther revelations.
"I don't know, of course, how far your wife's family are aware of what people say about Madame Olenska's refusal to accept her husband's latest offer."
Archer was silent, and Mr. Jackson obliquely continued,
"It's a pity. It's certainly a pity that she refused it."
"A pity? In God's name, why?" Mr. Jackson looked down his leg to the unwrinkled sock that joined it to a glossy pump.
"Well, to put it on the lowest ground, what's she going to live on now?" Now? If Beaufort—" Archer sprang up, his fist banging down on the black walnut edge of the writing table. The wells of the brass double inkstand danced in their sockets. "What the devil do you mean, sir?" Mr. Jackson, shifting himself slightly in his chair, turned a tranquil gaze on the young man's burning face. "Well, I have it on pretty good authority, in fact on old Catherine's herself, that the family reduced Countess Olenska's allowance considerably when she definitely refused to go back to her husband. And as, by this refusal, she also forfeits the money settled on her when she married, which Olenski was ready to make over to her if she returned— Why, what the devil do you mean, my dear boy, by asking me what I mean?" Mr. Jackson good-humouredly retorted. Archer moved toward the mantelpiece and bent over to knock his ashes into the grate. "I don't know anything of Madame Olenska's private affairs, but I don't need to be certain that what you insinuate—" "Oh, I don't. It's Lefferts, for one," Mr. Jackson interposed. "Lefferts, who made love to her and got snubbed for it," Archer broke out contemptuously. "Ah, did he?" snapped the other, as if this were exactly the fact he had been laying a trap for. He still sat sideways from the fire, so that his hard old gaze held Archer's face as if in a spring of steel. "Well, well, it's a pity she didn't go back before Beaufort's cropper," he repeated. "If she goes now, and if he fails, it will only confirm the general impression, which isn't by any means peculiar to Lefferts, by the way." "Oh, she won't go back now, less than ever." Archer had no sooner said it than he had once more the feeling that it was exactly what Mr. Jackson had been waiting for. The old gentleman considered him attentively. "That's your opinion, eh? Well, no doubt you know, but everybody will tell you that the few pennies Medora Manson has left are all in Beaufort's hands, and how the two women are to keep their heads above water unless he does, I can't imagine. Of course, Madame Olenska may still soften up old Catherine, who's been the most inexorably opposed to her staying, and old Catherine could make her any allowance she chooses. But we all know that she hates parting with good money, and the rest of the family have no particular interest in keeping Madame Olenska here." Archer was burning with unavailing wrath. He was exactly in the state when a man is sure to do something stupid, knowing all the while that he's doing it. He saw that Mr. Jackson had been instantly struck by the fact that Madame Olenska's differences with her grandmother and her other relations were not known to him, and that the old gentleman had drawn his own conclusions as to the reasons for Archer's exclusion from the family councils. This fact warned Archer to go warily, but the insinuations about Beaufort made him reckless. He was mindful, however, if not of his own danger, at least of the fact that Mr. Jackson was under his mother's roof, and consequently his guest. Old New York scrupulously observed the etiquette of hospitality, and no discussion with a guest was ever allowed to degenerate into a disagreement. "Shall we go up and join my mother?" he suggested curtly, as Mr. Jackson's last cone of ashes dropped into the brass ashtray at his elbow. On the drive homeward, May remained oddly silent. Through the darkness he still felt her enveloped in her menacing blush. What its menace meant he could not guess, but he was sufficiently warned by the fact that Madame Olenska's name had evoked it. They went upstairs, and he turned into the library. She usually followed him, but he heard her passing down the passage to her bedroom. "May," he called out impatiently, and she came back with a slight glance of surprise at his tone. "This lamp is smoking again. I should think the servants might see that it's kept properly trimmed," he grumbled nervously. "I'm so sorry. It shan't happen again," she answered, in the firm, bright tone she had learned from her mother, and it exasperated Archer to feel that she was already beginning to humour him like a younger Mr. Welland. She bent over to lower the wick, and as the light struck up on her white shoulders and the clear curves of her face, he thought, "How young she is! For what endless years this life will have to go on!" He felt with a kind of horror his own strong youth and the bounding blood in his veins. "Look here," he said suddenly, "I may have to go to Washington for a few days. Soon. Next week, perhaps." Her hand remained on the key of the lamp as she turned to him slowly. The heat from its flame had brought back a glow to her face, but it paled as she looked up. "On business?" she asked, in a tone which implied that there could be no other conceivable reason, and that she had put the question automatically, as if merely to finish his own sentence. "On business, naturally. There's a patent case coming up before the Supreme Court." He gave the name of the inventor, and went on furnishing details with all Lawrence Lefferts's practised glibness, while she listened attentively, saying at intervals, "Yes, I see." "The change will do you good," she said simply when he had finished, "and you must be sure to go and see Ellen," she added, looking him straight in the eyes with her cloudless smile, and speaking in the tone she might have employed in urging him not to neglect some irksome family duty. It was the only word that passed between them on the subject, but in the code in which they had both been trained it meant, "Of course you understand that I know all that people have been saying about Ellen, and heartily sympathize with my family in their effort to get her to return to her husband. I also know that, for some reason you have not chosen to tell me, you have advised her against this course, which all the older men of the family, as well as our grandmother, agree in approving, and that it is owing to your encouragement that Ellen defies us all, and exposes herself to the kind of criticism of which Mr. Sillerton Jackson probably gave you, this evening, the hint that has made you so irritable. Hints have indeed not been wanting, but since you appear unwilling to take them from others, I offer you this one myself, in the only form in which well-bred people of our kind can communicate unpleasant things to each other, by letting you understand that I know you mean to see Ellen when you are in Washington, and are perhaps going there expressly for that purpose, and that since you are sure to see her, I wish you to do so with my full and explicit approval, and to take the opportunity of letting her know what the course of conduct you have encouraged her in is likely to lead to." Her hand was still on the key of the lamp when the last word of this mute message reached him. She turned the wick down, lifted off the globe, and breathed on the sulky flame. "They smell less if one blows them out," she explained, with her bright housekeeping air. On the threshold she turned and paused for his kiss. End of chapter 26. Chapter 27. Wall Street the next day had more reassuring reports of Beaufort's situation. They were not definite, but they were hopeful. It was generally understood that he could call on powerful influences in case of emergency, and that he had done so with success, and that evening, when Mrs. Beaufort appeared at the opera wearing her old smile and a new emerald necklace, society drew a breath of relief. New York was inexorable in its condemnation of business irregularities. So far there had been no exception to its tacit rule that those who broke the law of probity must pay, and every one was aware that even Beaufort and Beaufort's wife would be offered up unflinchingly to this principle. But to be obliged to offer them up would be not only painful but inconvenient. The disappearance of the Beauforts would leave a considerable void in their compact little circle, and those who were too ignorant or too careless to shudder at the moral catastrophe bewailed in advance the loss of the best ballroom in New York. Archer had definitely made up his mind to go to Washington. He was waiting only for the opening of the lawsuit of which he had spoken to May, so that its date might coincide with that of his visit. But on the following Tuesday he learned from Mr. Letterblair that the case might be postponed for several weeks. Nevertheless, he went home that afternoon determined in any event to leave the next evening. The chances were that May, who knew nothing of his professional life and had never shown any interest in it, would not learn of the postponement, should it take place, nor remember the names of the litigants if they were mentioned before her, and at any rate he could no longer put off seeing Madame Olenska. There were too many things that he must say to her. On the Wednesday morning, when he reached his office, Mr. Letterblair met him with a troubled face. Beaufort, after all, had not managed to tide over, but by setting afloat the rumor that he had done so, he had reassured his depositors, and heavy payments had poured into the bank till the previous evening, when disturbing reports again began to predominate. In consequence, a run on the bank had begun, and its doors were likely to close before the day was over. The ugliest things were being said of Beaufort's dastardly manoeuvre, and his failure promised to be one of the most discreditable in the history of Wall Street. The extent of the calamity left Mr. Letterblair white and incapacitated. "I've seen bad things in my time, but nothing as bad as this. Everybody we know will be hit one way or another. And what will be done about Mrs. Beaufort? What can be done about her? I pity Mrs. Manson Mingott as much as anybody. Coming at her age, there's no knowing what effect this affair may have on her. She always believed in Beaufort. She made a friend of him. And there's the whole Dallas connection. Poor Mrs. Beaufort is related to every one of you. Her only chance would be to leave her husband. Yet how can anyone tell her so? Her duty is at his side, and luckily she seems always to have been blind to his private weaknesses." There was a knock, and Mr. Letterblair turned his head sharply. "What is it? I can't be disturbed."
A clerk brought in a letter for Archer and withdrew. Recognizing his wife's hand, the young man opened the envelope and read, "Won't you please come uptown as early as you can? Granny had a slight stroke last night. In some mysterious way she found out before anyone else this awful news about the bank. Uncle Lovell is away shooting, and the idea of the disgrace has made poor papa so nervous that he has a temperature and can't leave his room. Mamma needs you dreadfully, and I do hope you can get away at once and go straight to Granny's." Archer handed the note to his senior partner, and a few minutes later was crawling northward in a crowded horse-car, which he exchanged at 14th Street for one of the high, staggering omnibuses of the Fifth Avenue line. It was after 12 o'clock when this laborious vehicle dropped him at old Catherine's. The sitting-room window on the ground floor, where she was usually throned, was tenanted by the inadequate figure of her daughter, Mrs. Welland, who signed a haggard welcome as she caught sight of Archer, and at the door he was met by May. The hall wore the unnatural appearance peculiar to well-kept houses suddenly invaded by illness. Wraps and furs lay in heaps on the chairs, a doctor's bag and overcoat were on the table, and beside them letters and cards had already piled up unheeded. May looked pale but smiling. Dr. Bencomb, who had just come for the second time, took a more hopeful view, and Mrs. Mingott's dauntless determination to live and get well was already having an effect on her family. May led Archer into the old lady's sitting-room, where the sliding doors opening into the bedroom had been drawn shut, and the heavy yellow damask portieres dropped over them, and here Mrs. Welland communicated to him in horrified undertones the details of the catastrophe. It appeared that the evening before something dreadful and mysterious had happened. At about 8 o'clock, just after Mrs. Mingott had finished the game of solitaire that she always played after dinner, the doorbell had rung, and a lady so thickly veiled that the servants did not immediately recognize her had asked to be received. The butler, hearing a familiar voice, had thrown open the sitting-room door, announcing Mrs. Julius Beaufort, and had then closed it again on the two ladies. They must have been together, he thought, about an hour. When Mrs. Mingott's bell rang, Mrs. Beaufort had already slipped away unseen, and the old lady, white and vast and terrible, sat alone in her great chair, and signed to the butler to help her into the room. She seemed at that time, though obviously distressed, in complete control of her body and brain. The mulatto maid put her to bed, brought her a cup of tea as usual, laid everything straight in the room, and went away. But at 3 in the morning the bell rang again, and the two servants, hastening in at this unwonted summons, for old Catherine usually slept like a baby, had found their mistress sitting up against her pillows with a crooked smile on her face, and one little hand hanging limp from its huge arm. The stroke had clearly been a slight one, for she was able to articulate and to make her wishes known, and soon after the doctor's first visit she had begun to regain control of her facial muscles. But the alarm had been great, and proportionately great was the indignation when it was gathered from Mrs. Mingott's fragmentary phrases that Regina Beaufort had come to ask her, incredible effrontery, to back up her husband, see them through, not to desert them, as she called it, in fact to induce the whole family to cover and condone their monstrous dishonour. "I said to her, 'Honour's always been honour, and honesty honesty in Manson Mingott's house, and will be till I'm carried out of it feet first,' the old woman had stammered into her daughter's ear in the thick voice of the partly paralyzed. And when she said, 'But my name, auntie, my name's Regina Dallas,' I said, 'It was Beaufort when he covered you with jewels, and it's got to stay Beaufort now that he's covered you with shame.'" So much, with tears and gasps of horror, Mrs. Welland imparted, blanched and demoralized by the unwonted obligation of having at last to fix her eyes on the unpleasant and the discreditable. "If only I could keep it from our father-in-law. He always says, 'Augusta, for pity's sake, don't destroy my last illusions.' And how am I to prevent his knowing these horrors?" the poor lady wailed. "After all, mamma, he won't have seen them," her daughter suggested, and Mrs. Welland sighed. "Oh, no, thank heaven, he's safe in bed, and Dr. Bencomb has promised to keep him there till poor mamma is better, and Regina has been got away somewhere." Archer had seated himself near the window and was gazing out blankly at the deserted thoroughfare. It was evident that he had been summoned rather for the moral support of the stricken ladies than because of any specific aid that he could render. Mr. Lovell Mingott had been telegraphed for, and messages were being dispatched by hand to the members of the family living in New York, and meanwhile there was nothing to do but to discuss in hushed tones the consequences of Beaufort's dishonour and his wife's unjustifiable action. Mrs. Lovell Mingott, who had been in another room writing notes, presently reappeared, and added her voice to the discussion.
In their day, the elder ladies agreed, the wife of a man who had done anything disgraceful in business had only one idea, to efface herself, to disappear with him. There was the case of poor Grandmamma Spicer, your great-grandmother May. Of course, Mrs. Welland hastened to add, your great-grandfather's money difficulties were private, losses at cards, or signing a note for somebody. I never quite knew, because mamma would never speak of it. But she was brought up in the country because her mother had to leave New York after the disgrace, whatever it was. They lived up the Hudson alone, winter and summer, till mamma was 16. It would never have occurred to Grandmamma Spicer to ask the family to countenance her, as I understand Regina calls it, though a private disgrace is nothing compared to the scandal of ruining hundreds of innocent people. Yes, it would be more becoming in Regina to hide her own countenance than to talk about other people's, Mrs. Lovell Mingott agreed. I understand that the emerald necklace she wore at the opera last Friday had been sent on approval from Ball and Black's in the afternoon. I wonder if they'll ever get it back. Archer listened unmoved to the relentless chorus. The idea of absolute financial probity as the first law of a gentleman's code was too deeply ingrained in him for sentimental considerations to weaken it. An adventurer like Lemuel Struthers might build up the millions of his shoe polish on any number of shady dealings, but unblemished honesty was the noblesse oblige of old financial New York. Nor did Mrs. Beaufort's fate greatly move Archer. He felt, no doubt, more sorry for her than her indignant relatives, but it seemed to him that the tie between husband and wife, even if breakable in prosperity, should be indissoluble in misfortune. As Mr. Letterblair had said, a wife's place was at her husband's side when he was in trouble, but society's place was not at his side, and Mrs. Beaufort's cool assumption that it was seemed almost to make her his accomplice. The mere idea of a woman's appealing to her family to screen her husband's business dishonour was inadmissible, since it was the one thing that the family, as an institution, could not do. The mulatto maid called Mrs. Lovell Mingott into the hall, and the latter came back in a moment with a frowning brow. "She wants me to telegraph for Ellen Olenska. I had written to Ellen, of course, and to Medora, but now it seems that's not enough. I am to telegraph to her immediately, and to tell her that she's to come alone." The announcement was received in silence. Mrs. Welland sighed resignedly, and May rose from her seat and went to gather up some newspapers that had been scattered on the floor. "I suppose it must be done," Mrs. Lovell Mingott continued, as if hoping to be contradicted, and May turned back toward the middle of the room. "Of course it must be done," she said. "Granny knows what she wants, and we must carry out all her wishes. Shall I write the telegram for you, auntie? If it goes at once, Ellen can probably catch tomorrow morning's train." She pronounced the syllables of the name with a peculiar clearness, as if she tapped on two silver bells. "Well, it can't go at once. Jasper and the pantry boy are both out with notes and telegrams." May turned to her husband with a smile. "But here's Newland, ready to do anything. Will you take the telegram, Newland? There'll be just time before luncheon." Archer rose with a murmur of readiness, and she seated herself at old Catherine's rosewood bonheur du jour and wrote out the message in her large immature hand. When it was written she blotted it neatly and handed it to Archer. "What a pity," she said, "that you and Ellen will cross each other on the way. Newland," she added, turning to her mother and aunt, "is obliged to go to Washington about a patent lawsuit that is coming up before the Supreme Court. I suppose Uncle Lovell will be back by tomorrow night, and with Granny improving so much it doesn't seem right to ask Newland to give up an important engagement for the firm. Does it?" She paused, as if for an answer, and Mrs. Welland hastily declared, "Oh, of course not, darling. Your Granny would be the last person to wish it." As Archer left the room with the telegram, he heard his mother-in-law add, presumably to Mrs. Lovell Mingott, "But why on earth she should make you telegraph for Ellen Olenska?" And May's clear voice rejoin, "Perhaps it's to urge on her again that after all her duty is with her husband." The outer door closed on Archer, and he walked hastily away toward the telegraph office. End of chapter 27. Chapter 28. How you spell it anyhow?" asked the tart young lady to whom Archer had pushed his wife's telegram across the brass ledge of the Western Union office. "Olenska. O-len-ska," he repeated, drawing back the message in order to print out the foreign syllables above May's rambling script. "It's an unlikely name for a New York telegraph office, at least in this quarter," an unexpected voice observed, and turning around Archer saw Lawrence Lefferts at his elbow, pulling an imperturbable moustache and affecting not to glance at the message. "Hello, Newland. Thought I'd catch you here. I've just heard of old Mrs. Mingott's stroke, and as I was on my way to the house, I saw you turning down this street and nipped after you. I suppose you've come from there?"
Archer nodded and pushed his telegram under the lattice.
"Very bad, eh?" Lefferts continued. "Wiring to the family, I suppose. I gather it is bad if you're including the Countess Olenska."
Archer's lips stiffened. He felt a savage impulse to dash his fist into the long, vain, handsome face at his side.
"Why?" he questioned.
Lefferts, who was known to shrink from discussion, raised his eyebrows with an ironic grimace that warned the other of the watching damsel behind the lattice. Nothing could be worse form, the look reminded Archer, than any display of temper in a public place. Archer had never been more indifferent to the requirements of form, but his impulse to do Lawrence Lefferts a physical injury was only momentary. The idea of bandying Ellen Olenska's name with him at such a time, and on whatsoever provocation, was unthinkable. He paid for his telegram, and the two young men went out together into the street. There Archer, having regained his self-control, went on. "Mrs. Mingott is much better. The doctor feels no anxiety whatever." And Lefferts, with profuse expressions of relief, asked him if he had heard that there were beastly bad rumours again about Beaufort. That afternoon the announcement of the Beaufort failure was in all the papers. It overshadowed the report of Mrs. Manson Mingott's stroke, and only the few who had heard of the mysterious connection between the two events thought of ascribing old Catherine's illness to anything but the accumulation of flesh and years. The whole of New York was darkened by the tale of Beaufort's dishonour. There had never, as Mr. Letterblair said, been a worse case in his memory, nor for that matter in the memory of the far-off Letterblair who had given his name to the firm. The bank had continued to take in money for a whole day after its failure was inevitable, and as many of its clients belonged to one or another of the ruling clans, Beaufort's duplicity seemed doubly cynical. If Mrs. Beaufort had not taken the tone that such misfortunes, the word was her own, were the test of friendship, compassion for her might have tempered the general indignation against her husband. As it was, and especially after the object of her nocturnal visit to Mrs. Manson Mingott had become known, her cynicism was held to exceed his, and she had not the excuse, nor her detractors the satisfaction, of pleading that she was a foreigner. It was some comfort, to those whose securities were not in jeopardy, to be able to remind themselves that Beaufort was, but after all, if a Dallas of South Carolina took his view of the case, and glibly talked of his soon being on his feet again, the argument lost its edge, and there was nothing to do but to accept this awful evidence of the indissolubility of marriage. Society must manage to get on without the Beauforts, and there was an end of it. Except indeed for such hapless victims of the disaster as Medora Manson, the poor old Miss Lannings, and certain other misguided ladies of good family who, if only they had listened to Mr. Henry van der Luyden. "The best thing the Beauforts can do," said Mrs. Archer, summing it up as if she were pronouncing a diagnosis and prescribing a course of treatment, "is to go and live at Regina's little place in North Carolina. Beaufort has always kept a racing stable, and he had better breed trotting horses. I should say he had all the qualities of a successful horse-dealer." Everyone agreed with her, but no one condescended to inquire what the Beauforts really meant to do. The next day Mrs. Manson Mingott was much better. She recovered her voice sufficiently to give orders that no one should mention the Beauforts to her again, and asked, when Dr. Bencomb appeared, what in the world her family meant by making such a fuss about her health. "If people my age will eat chicken salad in the evening, what are they to expect?" she inquired. And the doctor having opportunely modified her dietary, the stroke was transformed into an attack of indigestion. But in spite of her firm tone, old Catherine did not wholly recover her former attitude toward life. The growing remoteness of old age, though it had not diminished her curiosity about her neighbours, had blunted her never very lively compassion for their troubles, and she seemed to have no difficulty in putting the Beaufort disaster out of her mind. But for the first time she became absorbed in her own symptoms, and began to take a sentimental interest in certain members of her family to whom she had hitherto been contemptuously indifferent. Mr. Welland, in particular, had the privilege of attracting her notice. Of her sons-in-law he was the one she had most consistently ignored, and all his wife's efforts to represent him as a man of forceful character and marked intellectual ability, if he had only chosen, had been met with a derisive chuckle. But his eminence as a valetudinarian now made him an object of engrossing interest, and Mrs. Mingott issued an imperial summons to him to come and compare diets as soon as his temperature permitted, for old Catherine was now the first to recognize that one could not be too careful about temperatures.
24 hours after Madame Olenska's summons, a telegram announced that she would arrive from Washington on the evening of the following day. At the Wellands', where the Newland Archers chanced to be lunching, the question as to who should meet her at Jersey City was immediately raised, and the material difficulties amid which the Welland household struggled as if it had been a frontier outpost lent animation to the debate. It was agreed that Mrs. Welland could not possibly go to Jersey City because she was to accompany her husband to Old Catherine's that afternoon, and the brougham could not be spared, since, if Mr. Welland were upset by seeing his mother-in-law for the first time after her attack, he might have to be taken home at a moment's notice. The Welland sons would of course be downtown, Mr. Lovell Mingott would be just hurrying back from his shooting, and the Mingott carriage engaged in meeting him, and one could not ask May, at the close of a winter afternoon, to go alone across the ferry to Jersey City, even in her own carriage. Nevertheless, it might appear inhospitable, and contrary to old Catherine's express wishes, if Madame Olenska were allowed to arrive without any of the family being at the station to receive her. It was just like Ellen, Mrs. Welland's tired voice implied, to place the family in such a dilemma. "It's always one thing after another," the poor lady grieved, in one of her rare revolts against fate. "The only thing that makes me think mamma must be less well than Dr. Bencomb will admit is this morbid desire to have Ellen come at once, however inconvenient it is to meet her." The words had been thoughtless, as the utterances of impatience often are, and Mr. Welland was upon them with a pounce. "Augusta," he said, turning pale and laying down his fork, "have you any other reason for thinking that Bencomb is less to be relied on than he was? Have you noticed that he has been less conscientious than usual in following up my case or your mother's?" It was Mrs. Welland's turn to grow pale as the endless consequences of her blunder unrolled themselves before her, but she managed to laugh and take a second helping of scalloped oysters before she said, struggling back into her old armour of cheerfulness, "Oh, my dear, how could you imagine such a thing? I only meant that, after the decided stand mamma took about its being Ellen's duty to go back to her husband, it seems strange that she should be seized with this sudden whim to see her, when there are half a dozen other grandchildren that she might have asked for. But we must never forget that mamma, in spite of her wonderful vitality, is a very old woman." Mr. Welland's brow remained clouded, and it was evident that his perturbed imagination had fastened at once on this last remark. "Yes, your mother's a very old woman, and for all we know Bencomb may not be as successful with very old people. As you say, my dear, it's always one thing after another, and in another 10 or 15 years I suppose I shall have the pleasing duty of looking about for a new doctor. It's always better to make such a change before it's absolutely necessary." And having arrived at this Spartan decision, Mr. Welland firmly took up his fork. "But all the while," Mrs. Welland began again, as she rose from the luncheon-table and led the way into the wilderness of purple satin and malachite known as the back drawing-room, "I don't see how Ellen's to be got here tomorrow evening, and I do like to have things settled for at least 24 hours ahead." Archer turned from the fascinated contemplation of a small painting representing 2 cardinals carousing, in an octagonal ebony frame set with medallions of onyx. "Shall I fetch her?" he proposed. "I can easily get away from the office in time to meet the brougham at the ferry, if May will send it there." His heart was beating excitedly as he spoke. Mrs. Welland heaved a sigh of gratitude, and May, who had moved away to the window, turned to shed on him a beam of approval. "So you see, mamma, everything will be settled 24 hours in advance," she said, stooping over to kiss her mother's troubled forehead. May's brougham awaited her at the door, and she was to drive Archer to Union Square, where he could pick up a Broadway car to carry him to the office. As she settled herself in her corner, she said, "I didn't want to worry mamma by raising fresh obstacles, but how can you meet Ellen tomorrow and bring her back to New York when you're going to Washington?" "Oh, I'm not going," Archer answered. "Not going? Why, what's happened?" Her voice was as clear as a bell and full of wifely solicitude. "The case is off. Postponed." "Postponed? How odd. I saw a note this morning from Mr. Letterblair to mamma saying that he was going to Washington tomorrow for the big patent case, that he was going to argue before the Supreme Court. You said it was a patent case, didn't you?" "Well, that's it. The whole office can't go. Letterblair decided to go this morning." "Then it's not postponed?" she continued, with an insistence so unlike her that he felt the blood rising to his face, as if he were blushing for her unwonted lapse from all the traditional delicacies. "No, but my going is," he answered, cursing the unnecessary explanations that he had given when he had announced his intention of going to Washington, and wondering where he had read that clever liars give details, but that the cleverest do not.
It did not hurt him half as much to tell May an untruth as to see her trying to pretend that she had not detected him. "I'm not going till later on, luckily for the convenience of your family," he continued, taking base refuge in sarcasm. As he spoke he felt that she was looking at him, and he turned his eyes to hers in order not to appear to be avoiding them. Their glances met for a second, and perhaps let them into each other's meanings more deeply than either cared to go.
"Yes, it is awfully convenient," May brightly agreed, "that you should be able to beat Ellen after all. You saw how much Mamma appreciated your offering to do it."
"Oh, I'm delighted to do it." The carriage stopped, and as he jumped out she leaned to him and laid her hand on his.
"Good-bye, dearest," she said,
her eyes so blue that he wondered afterward if they had shone on him through tears. He turned away and hurried across Union Square, repeating to himself in a sort of inward chant, "It's all of 2 hours from Jersey City to Old Catherine's. It's all of 2 hours, and it may be more."
End of Chapter 28.
Chapter 29. His wife's dark blue brougham, with the wedding varnish still on it, met Archer at the ferry, and conveyed him luxuriously to the Pennsylvania terminus in Jersey City. It was a sombre, snowy afternoon, and the gas lamps were lit in the big reverberating station. As he paced the platform waiting for the Washington express, he remembered that there were people who thought there would one day be a tunnel under the Hudson through which the trains of the Pennsylvania Railway would run straight into New York. They were of the brotherhood of visionaries who likewise predicted the building of ships that would cross the Atlantic in 5 days, the invention of a flying machine, lighting by electricity, telephonic communication without wires, and other Arabian Night marvels.
"I don't care which of their visions comes true," Archer mused, "as long as the tunnel isn't built yet." In his senseless schoolboy happiness he pictured Madame Olenska's descent from the train, his discovery of her a long way off, among the throngs of meaningless faces, her clinging to his arm as he guided her to the carriage, their slow approach to the wharf among slipping horses, laden carts, vociferating teamsters, and then the startling quiet of the ferry-boat, where they would sit side by side under the snow, in the motionless carriage, while the earth seemed to glide away under them, rolling to the other side of the sun. It was incredible the number of things he had to say to her, and in what eloquent order they were forming themselves on his lips. The clanging and groaning of the train came nearer, and it staggered slowly into the station like a prey-laden monster into its lair. Archer pushed forward, elbowing through the crowd and staring blindly into window after window of the high-hung carriages. And then suddenly he saw Madame Olenska's pale and surprised face close at hand, and had again the mortified sensation of having forgotten what she looked like. They reached each other, their hands met, and he drew her arm through his. "This way. I have the carriage," he said. After that it all happened as he had dreamed. He helped her into the brougham with her bags, and had afterward the vague recollection of having properly reassured her about her grandmother and given her a summary of the Beaufort situation. He was struck by the softness of her. Poor Regina. Meanwhile the carriage had worked its way out of the coil about the station, and they were crawling down the slippery incline to the wharf, menaced by swaying coal carts, bewildered horses, dishevelled express wagons, and an empty hearse. Ah, that hearse! She shut her eyes as it passed and clutched at Archer's hand. "If only it doesn't mean poor Granny." "Oh, no, no, she's much better. She's all right, really. There, we've passed it," he exclaimed, as if that made all the difference. Her hand remained in his, and as the carriage lurched across the gangplank onto the ferry, he bent over, unbuttoned her tight brown glove, and kissed her palm as if he had kissed a relic. She disengaged herself with a faint smile, and he said, "You didn't expect me today?" "Oh, no." "I meant to go to Washington to see you. I'd made all my arrangements. I very nearly crossed you in the train." "Oh!" she exclaimed, as if terrified by the narrowness of their escape. "Do you know, I hardly remembered you." "Hardly remembered me?" "I mean, how shall I explain? It's always so. Each time you happen to me all over again." "Oh, yes, I know, I know." Do I too, to you?" he insisted. She nodded, looking out of the window. "Ellen,
Ellen, Ellen!"
She made no answer, and he sat in silence watching her profile grow indistinct against the snow-streaked dusk beyond the window. What had she been doing in all those 4 long months, he wondered? How little they knew of each other, after all. The precious moments were slipping away, but he had forgotten everything that he had meant to say to her, and could only helplessly brood on the mystery of their remoteness and their proximity, which seemed to be symbolized by the fact of their sitting so close to each other and yet being unable to see each other's faces.
"What a pretty carriage! Is it May's?" she asked, suddenly turning her face from the window.
"Yes."
"It was May who sent you to fetch me, then? How kind of her!"
He made no answer for a moment. Then he said explosively, "Your husband's secretary came to see me the day after we met in Boston." In his brief letter to her he had made no allusion to Monsieur Riviere's visit, and his intention had been to bury the incident in his bosom. But her reminder that they were in his wife's carriage provoked him to an impulse of retaliation. He would see if she liked his reference to Riviere any better than he liked hers to May. As on certain other occasions when he had expected to shake her out of her usual composure, she betrayed no sign of surprise, and at once he concluded, "He writes to her, then."
"Monsieur Riviere went to see you?"
"Yes. Didn't you know?"
"No,"
she answered simply. "And you're not surprised?" She hesitated.
"Why should I be? He told me in Boston that he knew you, that he'd met you in England, I think."
"Ellen, I must ask you one thing."
"Yes."
"I wanted to ask it after I saw him, but I couldn't put it in a letter. It was Riviere who helped you get away, when you left your husband." His heart was beating suffocatingly. Would she meet this question with the same composure?
"Yes, I owe him a great debt," she answered, without the least tremor in her quiet voice. Her tone was so natural, so almost indifferent, that Archer's turmoil subsided. Once more she had managed by her sheer simplicity to make him feel stupidly conventional just when he thought he was flinging convention to the winds. "I think you're the most honest woman I ever met," he exclaimed.
"Oh, no, but probably one of the least fussy," she answered, a smile in her voice. "Call it what you like. You look at things as they are."
"Ah, I've had to look at the Gorgon."
"Well, it hasn't blinded you. You've seen that she's just an old bogey like all the others."
"She doesn't blind one, but she dries up one's tears."
The answer checked the pleading on Archer's lips. It seemed to come from depths of experience beyond his reach. The slow advance of the ferry-boat had ceased, and her bows bumped against the piles of the slip with a violence that made the brougham stagger, and flung Archer and Madame Olenska against each other. The young man, trembling, felt the pressure of her shoulder, and passed his arm about her. "If you're not blind, then, you must see that this can't last."
"What can't?"
"Our being together and not together."
"No, you ought not to have come today," she said in an altered voice, and suddenly she turned, flung her arms about him, and pressed her lips to his. At the same moment the carriage began to move, and a gas lamp at the head of the slip flashed its light into the window. She drew away, and they sat silent and motionless while the brougham struggled through the congestion of carriages about the ferry landing. As they gained the street, Archer began to speak hurriedly. "Don't be afraid of me. You needn't squeeze yourself back into your corner like that. A stolen kiss isn't what I want. Look, I'm not even trying to touch the sleeve of your jacket. Don't suppose that I don't understand your reasons for not wanting to let this feeling between us dwindle into an ordinary hole-and-corner love affair. I couldn't have spoken like this yesterday, because when we've been apart, and I'm looking forward to seeing you, every thought is burnt up in a great flame. But then you come, and you're so much more than I remembered. What I want of you is so much more than an hour or two every now and then, with wastes of thirsty waiting between, that I can sit perfectly still beside you like this, with that other vision in my mind, just quietly trusting to it to come true." For a moment she made no reply. Then she asked, hardly above a whisper, "What do you mean by trusting it to come true?" "Why, you know it will, don't you?" "Your vision of you and me together?" She burst into a sudden hard laugh. "You choose your place well to put it to me." "Do you mean because we're in my wife's brougham? Shall we get out and walk, then? I don't suppose you mind a little snow." She laughed again, more gently. "No, I shan't get out and walk, because my business is to get to Granny's as quickly as I can, and you'll sit beside me and we'll look, not at visions, but at realities." "I don't know what you mean by realities. The only reality to me is this." She met the words with a long silence, during which the carriage rolled down an obscure side street and then turned into the searching illumination of Fifth Avenue. "Is it your idea, then, that I should live with you as your mistress, since I can't be your wife?" she asked him. The crudeness of the question startled him. The word was one that women of his class fought shy of, even when their talk flitted closest about the topic. He noticed that Madame Olenska pronounced it as if it had a recognized place in her vocabulary, and he wondered if it had been used familiarly in her presence, in the horrible life she had fled from. Her question pulled him up with a jerk, and he floundered. I want somehow to get away with you into a world where words like that, categories like that, won't exist, where we shall be simply two human beings who love each other, who are the whole of life to each other, and nothing else on earth will matter." She drew a deep sigh that ended in another laugh. "Oh, my dear, where is that country? Have you ever been there?" she asked, and as he remained sullenly dumb, she went on, "I know so many who've tried to find it, and believe me, they all got out by mistake at wayside stations, at places like Boulogne or Pisa or Monte Carlo, and it wasn't at all different from the old world they'd left, but only rather smaller and dingier, and more promiscuous." He had never heard her speak in such a tone, and he remembered the phrase she had used a little while before. "Yes, the Gorgon has dried your tears," he said. "Well, she opened my eyes too. It's a delusion to say that she blinds people. What she does is just the contrary. She fastens their eyelids open so that they're never again in the blessed darkness. Isn't there a Chinese torture like that? There ought to be. Ah, believe me, it's a miserable little country." The carriage had crossed 42nd Street. May's sturdy brougham horse was carrying them northward as if he had been a Kentucky trotter. Archer choked with the sense of wasted minutes and vain words. "Then what exactly is your plan for us?" he asked. "For us? But there's no us in that sense. We're near each other only if we stay far from each other. Then we can be ourselves. Otherwise we're only Newland Archer, the husband of Ellen Olenska's cousin, and Ellen Olenska, the cousin of Newland Archer's wife, trying to be happy behind the backs of the people who trust them." "Ah, I'm beyond that," he groaned. "No, you're not. You've never been beyond. And I have," she said in a strange voice, "and I know what it looks like there." He sat silent, dazed with inarticulate pain. Then he groped in the darkness of the carriage for the little bell that signalled orders to the coachman. He remembered that May rang twice when she wished to stop. He pressed the bell, and the carriage drew up beside the curbstone. "Why are we stopping? This is not Granny's," Madame Olenska exclaimed. "No, I shall get out here," he stammered, opening the door and jumping to the pavement. By the light of a street lamp he saw her startled face and the instinctive motion she made to detain him. He closed the door and leaned for a moment in the window. "You're right. I ought not to have come today," he said, lowering his voice so that the coachman would not hear. She bent forward and seemed about to speak, but he had already called out the order to drive on, and the carriage rolled away while he stood on the corner. The snow was over, and a tingling wind had sprung up that lashed his face as he stood gazing. Suddenly he felt something stiff and cold on his lashes, and perceived that he had been crying, and that the wind had frozen his tears. He thrust his hands in his pockets and walked at a sharp pace down Fifth Avenue to his own house. End of chapter 29.